Right now, the world is watching global oil prices surge past $72.50 a barrel. United States envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are scrambling into secure briefing rooms in Geneva to avert a Middle East conflict. Mainstream media networks are hyper-focused on the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier dropping anchor in the Mediterranean Sea. Washington is consumed by United States President Donald Trump issuing late-night social media threats directed at Tehran. Sounds like a standard geopolitical crisis. Sounds like a Middle East supply shock. Sounds like Washington dictating global security. But what you are actually watching is the perfect distraction for the most calculated restructuring of North American energy dominance in 50 years. While the United States military and diplomatic apparatus is entirely consumed by the Iranian nuclear standoff, Washington has left itself completely blind to its own northern border. Exactly 48 hours before the Geneva talks began on Thursday, February 26, 2026, former central banker and current Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney executed a quiet $4.8 billion provisional energy export framework with the European Union. Physical weakness in the North Sea oil market proves that current global prices are driven entirely by fear of conflict rather than actual current shortages. While Trump is consumed by manufactured panic abroad, Canada is quietly locking the gates on the energy supply the American economy requires to survive. For decades, working-class Canadians were told their national role was to be the polite, reliable gas station for the American industrial machine. Previous generations watched Ottawa bend to Washington during the fierce 1980s free trade agreement debates. Canadians watched their governments consistently export raw resources south while importing finished goods north in a permanently subordinate economic loop. Canada appeared weak when it integrated its vital energy supply chains to endlessly feed the United States Gulf Coast refineries. But what arrogant American strategists did not see was that historical accommodation was never submission. It was the deliberate, quiet stockpiling of absolute structural leverage. The polite neighbor routine was a highly calculated choice to let America burn through its geopolitical goodwill, while Ottawa quietly built the ultimate failsafe. Canadians remember the 1970s energy shocks when resource wealth provided genuine geopolitical power. Canada simply waited for the global board to reset. Consider how the Canadian leverage map is actually constructed across the continent. Alberta currently supplies 4.2 million barrels of crude oil per day to the United States market. That single provincial output accounts for an irreplaceable 62% of total American petroleum imports. Simultaneously, Quebec commands a massive hydroelectrical grid that continuously powers entire regions of the American Northeast. Mainstream analysts and American politicians treat these vital assets as fragmented regional commodities. They mistakenly believe internal Canadian divisions neutralize this continental power. In reality, Alberta's heavy crude, Saskatchewan's critical uranium, and Quebec's electrical capacity function together as an integrated national geopolitical weapon. Each region brings unique, devastating leverage to the table, perfectly designed to hold the American economy hostage when necessary. Canada spent 50 years meticulously building this specific trap, and the timing to spring it is mathematically perfect. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve currently sits at a critically depleted 340 million barrels. That number represents a 40-year low. This deliberate depletion leaves the entire American economy exposed to immediate, devastating consumer price shocks if Canadian supply pipelines are throttled even marginally. The global physical oil market is currently operating on pure fear, with paper markets pricing in massive risk premiums. Saudi Arabia is attempting to boost oil production by 137,000 barrels per day. But that contingency output is completely insufficient to cover a full Strait of Hormuz closure. That physical reality makes Canadian crude the absolute only reliable lifeline remaining for the United States economy. Canadian leaders did not panic during previous trade disputes or border closures. They did not capitulate to intense American economic pressure. They did not post emotional reactions or tweet back at juvenile presidential insults. Instead, Ottawa waited for the exact moment when the United States would stretch its military and diplomatic resources to the breaking point across the globe. That moment has finally arrived, and the geopolitical weapon is fully loaded. But to understand why Canada is finally pulling the trigger on American energy dependence, you have to look at the exact catalyst that forced Ottawa to recognize its closest neighbor as an active, unpredictable threat. This aggressive, historic pivot away from American integration is happening entirely because the President of the United States decided to treat Canadian sovereignty as a theoretical concept to be openly mocked. The crisis unfolding is not an accident of geography or a standard bilateral trade dispute. It is a direct, unavoidable response to a documented pattern of unprecedented disrespect. While Donald Trump positions the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean Sea to project global dominance, he completely ignores the structural collapse he is actively triggering in his own hemisphere. His own Defense Intelligence Agency confirms that Iranian intercontinental ballistic missile threats to the American homeland are a full decade away, specifically modeling a 2035 scenario at the absolute earliest. Yet Trump deliberately manufactures immediate existential panic regarding the Middle East to justify his chaotic military posturing. He deploys real estate developers like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Geneva on Thursday, February 26, 2026, to handle delicate world-altering nuclear diplomacy. Within hours of that diplomatic deployment, he completely contradicts his own State Department. Simultaneously, he issues aggressive all-caps ultimatums on the Truth Social platform, warning of a very bad day for Tehran if they do not unconditionally surrender to his demands. This documented timeline proves a complete lack of systemic diplomatic logic. Praised one week, punished the next. Ordered to negotiate in the morning, threatened with annihilation in the afternoon. It is the exact mechanic of a leader who operates purely on impulse and intimidation, entirely blind to the massive vulnerabilities of his own borders. Because Donald Trump chose to publicly threaten Canada with devastating 100% tariffs, and because he chose to openly disrespect the Canadian Prime Minister by calling him governor, he has forced Ottawa to recognize the United States not as an ally, but as an active existential threat. Foreign Policy magazine recently published a detailed analysis drawing the geopolitical parallel explicitly. They described a superpower seeking to expand its borders, deliberately inflaming nearby separatist movements to assert regional dominance and cleave apart a sovereign neighboring state. Those are the exact mechanics that preceded the crisis in eastern Ukraine in 2014. The only difference is this time the power executing the hostile annexation playbook is not Russia, it is the United States. The Financial Times broke a major story revealing that Trump administration officials had been meeting directly on multiple occasions with far-right separatists in Alberta, not through back channels, not through anonymous intermediaries. These were direct face-to-face meetings with hostile political actors who openly want to break their resource-rich province away from Canada and attach it to the United States. This is a survival-level threat to Canadian territorial integrity. Faced with this overt hostility and blatant territorial interference, Canada did not panic. Canada did not capitulate. Canada did not issue diplomatic apologies, begging for Washington's understanding. Instead, Ottawa accelerated a comprehensive, fully funded architecture of total economic independence. Exactly 48 hours before the Geneva nuclear talks even began, a historic $4.8 billion provisional energy export framework was quietly executed between Canada and the European Union. Let me show you the exact technical mechanism of how this agreement fundamentally dismantles American energy dominance. This $4.8 billion framework actively bypasses United States Gulf Coast refineries entirely. Historically, Canadian crude flowed south through continental pipelines to Texas, where American corporations captured the refining margins and controlled global export access. The new European framework utilizes a newly accelerated $1.2 billion Arctic maritime infrastructure project. By legally and physically restructuring the export pipelines to flow north to Canadian deepwater ports rather than south across the American border, Canadian crude is now loaded directly onto specialized ice-breaking tankers, destined straight for European markets. This physically severs the American middleman from the supply chain. It redirects the profit margins and the physical products straight across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the Gulf Coast refineries starved of the heavy crude they are specifically engineered to process. Canada is actively diverting the 62% of total American petroleum imports that originate from north of the border. These are not theoretical plans drafted in a political think tank. These are fully funded, legally binding shifts in global supply chains that leave the United States completely isolated. In just 6 months, Canada has signed 12 separate trade and security agreements on 4 continents, including a new strategic partnership with Qatar and active negotiations with India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Ottawa is pushing to build a permanent trade bridge with the European Union, encompassing 1.5 billion consumers. But the economic divorce is only the surface layer. The Canadian defense budget for the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year has been forcefully set at 62.7 billion Canadian dollars. Total planned defense investment over the next decade is $900 billion. $2 billion of that new immediate spending is specifically earmarked to diversify Canada's defense partnerships and strictly reduce military dependence on the United States. Canada is fully joining the European Union's secure defense procurement integration programs. Only 16 American-made F-35 fighter jets have been officially committed. The rest of the massive procurement order is actively under review as Canada looks to secure European aerospace alternatives. Every single dollar, every single barrel of oil, and every single trade agreement is systematically engineered to build a wall of absolute Canadian self-sufficiency. This means Canada no longer has to consider American feelings when making national security decisions. The nuclear option of completely cutting off United States access to Canadian resources is now fully viable and operational. This flawlessly executed multi-billion-dollar decoupling is not the result of standard political maneuvering. It is the calculated execution of a mastermind orchestrating a complete continental shift. This ruthless efficiency is exactly what happens when a nation installs a former central banker to execute geopolitical warfare. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, who also brings deep structural experience from Goldman Sachs, became prime minister specifically because Canadians wanted an architect who would not flinch. He does not govern by emotion. He does not govern by social media algorithms. He operates entirely on cold data, systemic leverage, and flawless financial architecture. Let me show you exactly how a former central banker thinks through a geopolitical crisis. He uses a strict systemic risk assessment matrix, stripping away the political noise to focus purely on structural vulnerabilities. Carney does not look at the United States and see an untouchable military superpower. He looks at Washington and sees an over-leveraged debtor holding critically depleted assets. Using rigorous stress test modeling, the former central banker identified the exact threshold where depleted American crude reserves converted Canadian energy supply from a simple traded commodity into a lethal weapon. He calculated the precise breaking point of the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve at exactly 340 million barrels. He factored in the stakeholder analysis of European markets desperate for stable supply chains. Once the mathematical threshold of American vulnerability was officially breached, his risk matrix dictated the immediate execution of the European bypass framework. He executed the $4.8 billion European deal exactly 48 hours before the Geneva talks because his timing models predicted the exact moment the American diplomatic apparatus would be completely distracted. While Donald Trump flails wildly between aggressive military posturing with aircraft carriers in Crete and dispatching completely unqualified real estate developers like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to chaotic nuclear negotiations in Geneva, Mark Carney utilizes complex spreadsheets to quietly dismantle American energy security. Trump relies on impulsive tantrums to intimidate. The former central banker relies on structural mathematics to conquer. When the President of the United States issues insults, the former Bank of England governor does not panic. He does not capitulate. He does not tweet back. His deliberate silence in the face of presidential provocation is not weakness. It is the absolute intellectual dismissal of an inferior mind, proving that Canadian competence easily outmaneuvers American bravado. Because of this unparalleled technocratic competence, Canada is securely executing an official relationship status change. The polite fiction of the North American Brotherhood is officially dead, and the separation is now an undeniable institutional fact. Canadian military intelligence accurately modeled this exact Middle East escalation 3 full months ago. They watched Washington blindly stumble into another massive regional crisis while completely ignoring the security of its own borders. As the United States conducts partial panicked evacuations of its embassy in Beirut, thoroughly exposing the severe fragility of the American security umbrella, Canada is forcefully cutting the cord. This is not a temporary political dispute that will magically resolve when the current administration leaves office. Listen to how the highest levels of the military establishment are permanently framing this break. Retired Major General Scott Clancy, who served directly as the Director of Operations at NORAD, put it this way: "What lingers is an underpinning of distrust that is no longer emotional, it is factual. It is no longer going to be a relational approach to the United States. It is going to be transactional. From relational to transactional, that single documented shift represents the most significant change in North American geopolitics since NATO was founded in 1949. Think about what that means. When the highest levels of NORAD declare the relationship transactional, it means the entire defense and resource apparatus is actively unwinding 50 years of integration. It means every single barrel of heavy crude and every single megawatt of electricity will now be leveraged for maximum Canadian advantage. The emotional divorce is completely authorized by the military establishment itself. The historical debt is entirely paid. This means Canada no longer owes the United States any deference, any loyalty, or any guaranteed energy security in times of global crisis. Canadians are finally totally liberated from the suffocating guilt of neighborly obligation. You are completely free to prioritize Canadian prosperity and watch the United States face the catastrophic consequences of its own arrogant miscalculations. The bilateral relationship is permanently severed, and the devastating financial fallout is rushing directly toward the American heartland. Because the President of the United States deliberately chose to insult his most vital and reliable energy supplier, American citizens are about to learn a brutal, highly localized lesson in basic geopolitical economics. The historic buffer is entirely gone. Because the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve is depleted to a critical 40-year low, the immediate financial devastation will not be spread out over months or years. It will hit working-class American households in a matter of days. If the new Canadian deepwater maritime infrastructure redirects that massive volume of heavy crude exclusively to the European Union, the American Midwest is mathematically modeled to collapse first. Energy costs across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio are projected to surge by exactly 38% within 3 weeks of the physical pipeline diversion. Manufacturing facilities in those specific states will be forced to halt production. Trucking logistics across the American heartland will completely freeze. Everyday Americans will pay a catastrophic daily price for the arrogant diplomatic miscalculations made by Donald Trump in Washington. But while the American economy faces this unprecedented supply shock, Canadians must take immediate, calculated steps to completely insulate themselves from the collateral damage. You are not just a spectator to this continental shift. You must be an active participant in this historic wealth transfer. To protect your own assets from the coming American supply chain collapse, you must execute specific defensive maneuvers right now. You must begin by moving exactly 15% of your United States dollar cash holdings back into Canadian dollars immediately. This front runs the inevitable currency fluctuation that will occur when American industrial output officially drops. You also need to audit your personal retirement portfolios and ruthlessly eliminate any exposure to United States Gulf Coast refineries. Those specific southern facilities are about to be completely starved of their primary heavy crude inputs. Furthermore, you must lock in your domestic long-term fixed energy rates immediately before the new European export agreements fully alter North American baseline utility pricing. With your personal financial perimeter officially secured, you must watch the geopolitical board carefully over the next 60 days. This massive structural transition will follow one of three specific paths. The accommodation scenario happens if Donald Trump suddenly realizes the catastrophic leverage Mark Carney holds and quietly folds his public tariff threats to keep the lights on in the American Midwest. If Washington panics and attempts desperate, aggressive border blockades, that triggers the escalation scenario, which will only accelerate the multi-billion-dollar European export bypass. But the ultimate conclusion is the complete rupture scenario. This is the permanent, irreversible severing of the entire Keystone Pipeline network, signaling that Canada has officially closed the American gas station forever. What you are witnessing right now is the permanent redrawing of the global geopolitical map. Canada has finally weaponized its ultimate structural advantage, and America will not realize what it has truly lost until it is far too late to get it back.